this. Be nice to be there in person, but this is a good second best. So going right to the talk. On May 23rd, 2014, in Isla Vista, California, 22-year-old Elliot Rodger went on a shooting spree, killing 6 people and injuring 14 others. Shortly before his murderous rampage, he uploaded a manifesto in which he outlined his motivations. In his twisted way, he thought it a cosmic injustice that sorority women were spurning him. He wanted revenge and took it in an undiscriminating fashion. A few years later, self-styled white nationalists, quote unquote, marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, chanting variously, "You will not replace us," and "Jews will not replace us." The background perception being that other racial and ethnic groups were, through an alleged conspiracy, gaining power and status that the white supremacists thought was rightfully theirs. One rammed his car into a group of counter-protesters. Sometimes, as in these cases, the toxic grievances issue in violent action, in outbursts of terror. Sometimes, as we see in a variety of forms in contemporary political life, these grievances influence one's voting. Sometimes they lead to posturing displays of power or verbal tirades on Twitter. Sometimes hostility simmers in more subterranean ways, in passive aggression and fantasies of revenge, without anything much being done. We academics will be familiar with a milder and less dangerous form of a similar phenomenon. Those, for example, who feel justly or unjustly that they've gotten insufficient professional recognition and then stew in spiteful anger and spout their vitriol in the blogosphere or in barbed requests simply for clarification in Q&A sessions or behind the anonymity of cuttingly dismissive referee reports. What's going on in these cases? Well, much will depend on the psychological specifics. We might describe these agents as beset with some combination of anger, vengefulness, envy, resentment. But there's also, I suggest, a more specific potential diagnosis we might want to avail ourselves of as well, namely ressentiment. This notion of ressentiment is, of course, most famously associated with Nietzsche, who made it a key element of his account in On the Genealogy of Morality. Now, Nietzsche didn't coin the term, and he didn't introduce the term into philosophical discourse either, but he's perhaps done the most to bring it to the attention of philosophical readers today and to contribute to our understanding of the psychology underlying it. His efforts in this direction are, to my mind, one of his most lasting contributions to philosophy. At the same time, Nietzsche's own analysis is closely bound up with his specific project of thinking through the genesis and the ongoing influence of Judeo-Christian moral values. So he's less interested in giving us a well-delineated theory of what the state in general is, suggestive those remarks are, than he is in charting its relation to this morality, as well as the role it plays in certain kinds of internalized forms of self-cruelty. Moreover, since his interests lie with the consideration and in large part an indictment of this Judeo-Christian morality and its legacy, he focuses on the cases of ressentiment that are most relevant to this. And in the process, he offers us some telling examples of ressentiment, but they're arguably not the sole or even the main cases of it. And if we try to build a general theory of ressentiment just from these particular cases, we might be led astray. Specifically, we might be misled into thinking that ressentiment is only the reaction of people who are under conditions of systematic powerlessness and deprivation, or we might be misled into thinking that it's a reaction that confines itself to repressed or subterranean channels. But this, I think, is too limiting. It's also, I suggest here, sometimes the reaction of the comparatively well-off, those who have a strong sense of entitlement, who feel they aren't getting their due. And it sometimes expresses itself in outward action and turns violent. Many of its most disturbing cases, in fact, fall into this mold. It's potentially an attitude of oppressors as well as of the oppressed, of the powerful as well as the powerless, and of many ordinary folks who fall in between. Given the notion's prevalence within Nietzsche's work and relative neglect in Anglophone moral philosophy, Ressentiment has had its most extensive and philosophically rich discussion within the orbit of Nietzsche interpretation. So I'll say a little bit very briefly about some issues in Nietzsche interpretation, but this is mainly not a paper that's interpretive in focus. The Nietzsche is, of course, situating his discussion in this large speculative narrative about the underpinnings of this psychology and its place in various forms of social transformation. And though his account is instructive, I'm not going to be wedding myself to any of the details. My goal here is instead to offer a freestanding theory of this familiar and I think vicious psychological condition that's usefully labeled with this term. So in the process, what I'm going to try to do is chart the terrain around ressentiment and some closely related and sometimes overlapping states. Ordinary moral resentment, envy, vengefulness, anger, and the like, and seek to explain what's ethically objectionable as well as psychologically pernicious about ressentiment. As I'll contend in this paper, ressentiment isn't simply a $10 word that's substitutable for resentment, though it is a species of that genus, a type of resentment. My account puts a particular emphasis on the perception that one has been slighted, insulted, or demeaned, and puts this at the heart of ressentiment. So this, I will suggest, is at least as important in understanding ressentiment as seeing it as rooted in powerlessness per se is. And I think the latter, particularly given Nietzsche's focus on the so-called will to power, has tended to guide, indeed to monopolize discussions of ressentiment in a way that I think misses a core dimension of the underlying phenomenon. Likewise, I think we will also miss an important dimension if we take ressentiment to be captured in purely descriptive or explanatory terms. So if we just think it's about telling us why an agent is having a certain reaction and the role that that plays in the agent's psychological economy. On the view that I put forward, it's a more normatively laden term. To be prone to or to have ressentiment is to manifest a vice or to be temporarily in a vicious condition. So in this way, it's akin to avarice, cowardice, lecherousness, boorishness, and other more colorful flaws of character. So whereas resentment is the genus, which has both commendable and problematic manifestations, ressentiment, on my view, is one inherently vicious type of it. Some Nietzsche scholars, thinking they're taking their cue from the great immoralist Nietzsche himself, bend over so far backwards to avoid being moralizing with their treatment of ressentiment that they miss what, as I see it, is the ethical core of ressentiment, which is serving to identify an inherently criticizable phenomenon. Yet, however exactly we understand this state of ressentiment, it's an important and theoretically interesting subcategory that deserves more attention in moral psychology than it usually gets. This paper is an attempt to bring this sadly topical notion to the table for some further discussion in moral philosophy. So just very briefly on Nietzsche now. One of Nietzsche's key claims is that ressentiment is the engine of what he calls the slave revolt, which marks the transformation from a Greco-Roman warrior ethic centered around notions of good and bad to a Judeo-Christian morality centered around notions of good in a different sense now and evil. And I assume that the broad details of this narrative will be familiar to all of you. So my interest in this paper isn't in the role ressentiment is supposed to have played in creating or sustaining Judeo-Christian moral values, nor in the potential relevance of ressentiment to a critical evaluation of such values. These raise considerable complexities, both exegetical and philosophical, and I'm not going to go deeply into Nietzsche interpretation here, but I just want to briefly note the following points. It's sometimes thought, based on Nietzsche's main examples, that ressentiment arises just among the weak and the powerless, or that ressentiment involves vengefulness that's been repressed, or that ressentiment terminates in or is somehow bound up with value creation or revaluation, or finally that ressentiment needs to be a standing feature of character, that you're, as it were, a person of ressentiment. I won't go into the exegetical details here. We can if you want to in the Q&A. But in short, I don't think Nietzsche accepts any of those points, and he's been, I think, wrongly attributed them in the secondary literature. But in any event, Nietzsche's just a point of departure here for further reflection. So what I say and what follows is my own account that's inspired somewhat by Nietzsche. So now turning to the heart of that account, it's clear enough that ressentiment is in certain respects akin to a reactive attitude in the sense of that term we get from P.F. Strawson. It's a psychological condition involving a perception of something done to one, so thus partly backward-looking, an affective response to this, and certain forward-looking attitudes and wishes for redress. So in Ressentiment, some of the psychology is in common with Strawsonian resentment, but it's more specific in several ways and importantly different in several ways, which I go on to describe. In my view, it's a hybrid phenomenon in that it has a descriptive explanatory dimension, so it tells us what someone's feeling and why, and it also has a normative one. In aptly labeling something as ressentiment, we're not simply registering value-neutral psychological facts, but we're also making a normative judgment and censuring the agent who is displaying this condition. Ressentiment, as I understand it, is a state of the psyche involving 8 conditions, which are set out on the handout. So now we're on the back side of the second page of the handout at the top. So I won't read these off. I'll just discuss them. So just take a moment to read briefly these 8 conditions, and then I will go through them as it were individually. So these conditions here are, in the case of the first 7, descriptive of the agent's psychology. Condition 8, however, is a special one. Condition 8, in my view, is also crucial. According to the account I provide, ressentiment is a normatively laden phenomenon. Now, condition 8 here, though, is unusual because determining whether it's satisfied relies on a normative judgment, which presumably holds true in virtue of certain features of the agent. But what are these features exactly? Are they simply 1 through 7? My suspicion is no. The 1 through 7 are jointly necessary but not sufficient. I think we need a more nuanced, holistic assessment of the particular case, the specific shape that 6 and 7 especially, and their place in the agent's psychic economy have, in a way that's going to elude elaboration in terms of further conditions at least that are going to be usefully regulative for us. And that's tantamount to saying that there's a role that discerning and often controversial normative judgment plays in the application of this, as it were, ethical diagnosis in specific cases. Now, these normatively flavored phenomena are familiar in moral psychological life. People are boorish, cowardly, perverted, lecherous, judgmental, self-righteous, people-pleasing, or more colorfully but familiarly, assholes. And I recommend the study of Aaron James's entitled Assholes, a Theory for those interested in it further. My focus isn't on the niceties of these terms, nor to weigh in on rarefied debates in the philosophy of language and metaethics about thick terms or concepts more generally, but instead to suggest that there are these vice phenomena, however exactly they're to be analyzed. That much, I take it, should be fairly uncontroversial. I'll claim that ressentiment is a phenomenon like this. Now, as with the notions that I just mentioned, it can involve episodes, so cowardly of you not to speak up at the meeting, or it can involve alleged standing features of character. So you're a coward, your behavior once again demonstrated that. Ressentiment similarly can come in temporally limited episodes, or it can be a standing feature of character. So now just moving through the conditions with some more description. Ressentiment is provoked by something and frequently, though not always, takes that as its target. So this spark can be an isolated incident. Maybe Maria got the promotion and John didn't, or it can be a more standing condition. John is upset that no one seems to respect or appreciate his philosophical contributions. Often it's a combination of the two, where some particular incident taps into deeper and more pervasive feelings of inadequacy, indignation, or frustration. Sometimes the cause of ressentiment and its intentional object might come apart. So John might have ressentiment about Maria's promotion, but the cause, or at least a major cause of the ressentiment, is, let's suppose, his own feelings of inadequacy, which he may or may not fully admit to himself. Ressentiment is also a three-way relation. So there's the agent with ressentiment, there's the state or incident that it's a response to, and there's the putative perpetrator on whom the ire of the agent fixates. Now, this perpetrator, is described in condition 3 of mine, is the felt cause or state of the incident that the agent's reacting to. It's a constitutive part of ressentiment, I think, that blame for it is sought, or blame rather, is sought somewhere. So the person with ressentiment feels on some level that things are traceable to a perpetrator. This allegedly perpetrated individual or group is felt to be blameworthy, even if that makes no real reflective sense. The connection can be entirely tenuous, illogical, or non-existent. So someone might, for instance, be upset about his declining standard of living and blame a broad category of quote-unquote immigrants for that. Or one might have ressentiment towards some conspicuously successful person, even though that person hasn't led in any appreciable or intelligible way to the unfortunate, or let's be realistic, sometimes very moderately less fortunate state that one finds oneself in. What will make it a case of ressentiment instead of just envy is in part the primitive unconscious logic of this assignment of blame. It's also going to bring to bear a normative framework as well. The agent with ressentiment will feel something unjust or unfair has been done. I stress this point because ordinary moral resentment and ressentiment overlap a great deal. And in fact, it's striking how often the vocabulary of justice or fairness gets appealed to by agents of apparent ressentiment. And that happens even when the notion of justice or fairness is highly warped or reflective of a perverse sense of entitlement. Elliot Rodger's constant refrain centers around these notions. These women ought to be having sex with him and they aren't. And he distortedly perceives this to be deeply unfair and unjust. Now, ressentiment isn't a matter of just any sort of injury, however. It involves injuries, slights, or undesirable states of affairs that are perceived with a kind of indignation to represent an affront. The basic idea here is that the injury, slight, or state of affairs is one that insults or demeans your worth, either as a person or in some more specific role that you care particularly about, such as being an accomplished philosopher. Places where social hierarchies are in play are especially fertile territory for ressentiment. Yet, although we are often tempted by Nietzsche's main examples to think of ressentiment as coming, as it were, from the bottom of the hierarchy up, it needn't be that way. It also characterizes situations where people are at or near the very top of the pecking order and feel that this isn't being adequately respected. Witness, for instance, the fragile ego of Donald Trump, so easily slighted. Or take the case of the sulking Achilles. Or consider certain middle-class white supremacists or the proverbial well-off Trump voter. They might feel ressentiment toward people they think are encroaching on their territory, getting uppity, lazy moochers, getting things they don't deserve, and that they, these middle-class white people, are not getting the respect that they deserve for their upstandingness, hard work, and so on. Now, whether it's an instance of ressentiment is going to depend on the specifics of the case, and we're often not going to be in a good position to judge that. So I should stress that all of the real-world examples I give are governed by that crucial proviso. It's important to remember that although ressentiment is often felt toward those one perceives to be higher in the pecking order, it can also be felt toward those one perceives to be lower, or toward those one perceives to be one's equals. But for all we've said so far, this might just as well be an instance of ordinary moral resentment in the form of such indignation. A situation where someone's demeaning you or slighted you and you understandably are upset in response to this, that could fit the basic pattern of the first 5 conditions that I've set out on the handout. Yet it's how the agent processes and responds to this indignation, as well as the simmering of this indignation, condition 7, and the related anger and suffering in condition 1, that will take us into the distinctive territory of ressentiment. A desire for revenge is going to be notably paramount here. Now, sometimes these fantasies of revenge are consciously entertained on the part of the agent, as we see in the embittered narrator in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. Sometimes they're unacknowledged by the agent, the agent who claims to love his neighbor as himself, but still gets the thrill of vengefulness under the guise of the triumph of justice. But it will span these cases. And I think what people want when they want revenge varies, and it's often unclear even to they themselves what exactly they want, or whether they'd be satisfied if they got it, or even whether by their lights justice would in any way be served. And this is compounded in cases of ressentiment because the perceived perpetrators are often simply symbolic scapegoats, demonized by the agent of ressentiment for matters, bad constitutive luck, cosmic or systemic injustices, or alleged such injustices, over which these particular people had little or nothing personally to do, and for which they have little or nothing to answer for morally. Even when revenge does get taken, it's important, I think, that the agent dwells on the situation for a period. This means that ressentiment, while potentially episodic, has to be of some duration. And this is etymologically reflected in the word. Ressentiment has its root in sentir, to feel in French. Ressentir is to feel something again, the connotations here of reliving it vividly. The agent mulls over the slight, the perceived injustice, in some cases obsessively so, and thinks how that grievance might be redressed through vengeance, and fantasizes about, plots that revenge, and sometimes actually takes it. But we shouldn't make the common mistake that even if ressentiment begins here, it needs to end here. If we focus a great deal on the examples that Nietzsche gives, particularly in the first essay of the genealogy, we might think ressentiment-filled agents are those who are constitutionally powerless and incapable of taking real revenge, and so make do with these compensatory substitutes only. And that's certainly characteristic of some agents with ressentiment, but there's some who are capable of taking revenge and refrain from it for seemingly prudential reasons. And there's some who actually do take revenge, whether through petty passive aggression or savage violence or something in between. And that may or may not dissipate their underlying ressentiment. So now for the final and most complex and elusive point. The conditions 1 through 7 are not quite enough for understanding the charge of ressentiment. For it's not a purely descriptive notion, on my view. So to have ressentiment is to manifest a vice in an episode, or more deeply, an episode of behavior, or more deeply in character, if it's a standing feature of your personality. On my view, it is a vicious species of resentful indignation. But I think its vicious dimension can't be usefully specified in terms of further conditions. So that's why I want to say 1 through 7, they're necessary for ressentiment, but I don't think they're sufficient. I think identifying the cases of ressentiment is going to require an exercise in moral judgment to the effect that the agent in that condition is vicious on account of the particular shape and manifestation the conditions 1 through 7 take in his or her particular case. And so the cases of ressentiment, on my view, are going to be the cases where moral judgment is apt. Though I refrain from giving further specific conditions, I think we can at least try to do a bit more to explain what grounds such a judgment, that is, why it's a vice or an instance of vicious behavior in the cases where it is. Broadly speaking, there are two routes to explaining toward explaining what makes something a vice. And I'll just use the term vice, but I'm speaking about both vice as a standing feature of character and instances of vicious behavior. Now, one route is more functional. Something can be a vice, indolence, for instance, because the behavior or the character trait hampers one's flourishing as a person. So if you fritter away your entire day smoking pot, eating chips, watching television, you'll have certain higher possibilities of accomplishment foreclosed to you. That would be a way in which it's functionally problematic. Or it can be functionally problematic because it hampers the well-being and flourishing of a broader group. So if you're self-centered and uncooperative, it can fit that particular pattern. The second route to explaining why something is a vice is more constitutive. It says that the vicious behavior in itself constitutes an ethical defect. The classic Aristotelian vices provide one such model for this. The reaction and dispositions of the phronimos indicate, or maybe constitute, the mean in what is appropriate. But on this particular model, there are then excesses or deficiencies, extremes of overdoing it or underdoing it. So, for instance, the magnificent person might spend an appropriately large sum on a feast, but at one extreme, that of excess, the person will be tastelessly vulgar and spend too much. At the other extreme, the person will be stingy and spend too little. Now, to be clear, I'm not myself propounding that particular model here. I think it's too schematic to accommodate some vices we might want to talk about, but merely giving an example on which vices are a kind of constitutive demerit. Now, those two roots for understanding vice, the constitutive and the functional, they're compatible, since constitutive defects here on this Aristotelian model, excesses and deficiencies, those also are thought to have functional shortcomings. The crucial point with a constitutive view is that a vice's badness needn't consist solely in its functional shortcomings, where that's explained in terms of downstream effects that it has on your life or the life of those around you. With these broader ideas of the functional and the constitutive in mind, what are we to say about Ressentiment's vice profile? It can, I believe, partly be understood functionally. There are, that's to say, ways Ressentiment's bad for the agent afflicted by it because of what it leads to. It can tend to impair functioning through its potential for distorting effects on the rest of the psyche, for instance. Its frequently obsessive quality might steal energy from other tasks. Its retrospective focus might lead one to dwell on past slights rather than planning for the future. The self-deception it sometimes involves might undermine one's integrity as an agent. It might indeed lead you to outright self-destruction. And putting those things aside, it can have bad effects socially. People beset with ressentiment can make whole environments around them toxic, as we often say, whether by fostering ressentiment in others or simply creating an insalubrious atmosphere. When faced with people of ressentiment, we often want to keep a cordon sanitaire. Far worse can come of ressentiment as well, particularly when it turns violent. And this is why I think we need a careful, holistic look at the afflicted agent and a particular normative judgment about the manifestation in his or her case. But we shouldn't just stop with the functional as though that's the whole story. It can be vicious, I argue, also because it's constitutively bad. So here it's an ethical bad in itself, not because of some further thing that it leads to. But why, we wonder, might it be bad in itself? Now, of course, by their nature, such questions are notoriously difficult to answer in any informative way. One wants to say, well, it just is. To say something here a vice is good or bad in itself, here a vice is bad in itself, is already at or near a kind of explanatory bedrock. Now, I'm doubtful that this can be specified in terms of further necessary and sufficient conditions, except to note, which is of course rather unsatisfying, that it constitutes an ethical defect, the identifying of which requires an exercise in normative judgment. But by the same token, I'm doubtful we can give useful descriptive conditions for separating, say, the lecherous person from the simply horny person. We have to make recourse to moral judgment about the specific forms this person's behavior and attitudes take. And I think that's just a consequence of the condition's inherently normative inflection, coupled with a sensible holism and particularism in this domain. Now, to say that ressentiment is an objectionable psychic condition or ethical vice or defect, that's not to deny that it can have good effects. It might be conducive to creativity. It might make one work all the harder to prove oneself. It might give one a certain energy, and so on. And it's in general true of defects or vices that they can have that structure of potential benefit to oneself and to the world, as well as harm. An enduring lesson I think we get from Nietzsche, in fact, is that it's rare for things to be wholly good or wholly bad. Thanks to ressentiment, humanity, he claims, has become deeper and more interesting. Its complex effects are bound up in a way that's very difficult to disentangle. Similarly, as with other vices or flaws, there might be mitigating or excusing conditions for it. when we know more about how the agent ended up this way, either how they ended up with this as a trait of character or the background to the particular episode of behavior. Not, I hasten to add, with Elliot Rodger, whose autobiographical manifesto dripping with entitlement inspires little sympathy, but rather with some more borderline cases, perhaps. But that said, there's always, in my view, going to be something pro tanto bad about the state of ressentiment and something ethically defective about an agent who is in this state. We might be prone to think of it, to use another Nietzschean metaphor, as a kind of ugliness of character, so much so that we almost instinctively turn our heads and cringe when faced with its manifestations. It's not, of course, an explanation of its viciousness exactly, but it does reflect the fact that we regard it, like lecherousness, I think, as an especially repulsive form of vice. It's a defect of character even where the target of the ressentiment, in some sense, is an appropriate target of the reactive feelings. And I think that happens in some cases of ressentiment. So even in cases where the anger in some sense is justified, even morally justified, my view indicates that there's something problematic about slipping into ressentiment itself. So consider people with the right moral and political views, whatever those may be. The target of their criticism is blameworthy, deserving of censure, and so on. But in some cases, they've slipped from righteous anger into what many, I think, will rightly regard as a toxic, ugly condition. Social media and the blogosphere will quickly acquaint one with some ready examples of this. We should be careful not to conflate ressentiment and anger, however. In some circumstances, anger, including long-standing anger, is entirely the appropriate emotion to have. And my view on the topic is what we might describe as neo-Aristotelian. Anger is an appropriate emotion in certain circumstances. There's something meritorious about the agent who feels the appropriate amount of anger in the appropriate degree in the appropriate circumstances. And prima facie, at least, something wanting in the agent, the doormat, for instance, or the utterly affectless person who fails to feel anger when such anger is called for. So one who's opposed to ressentiment needn't be opposed to anger in all its forms, because while ressentiment involves anger, not all anger involves ressentiment. And an important distinction here is that anger needn't be bound up with a desire for revenge. So the angry agent might just want a sincere recognition of the harm caused, an apology from the wrongdoer, steps taken to rectify the issue in the future, and so on. But anger can slide into the territory of ressentiment. We all know of angry people who just can't let go, as we say, who felt appropriate anger initially, but continue to nurse the grievance well beyond that point. And those are sometimes cases of ressentiment. The most pernicious forms of ressentiment, as I think Nietzsche profoundly recognized, are those that are no longer episodic responses to some particular incident, but where the ressentiment becomes the agent's default orientation toward the world. Now, of course, angry agents can be challenging to be around as well, and general discomfort on the part of others needn't be a consideration against their justified anger. It might be good and appropriate that they make others upset by drawing attention to an injustice that's difficult to face. The mere fact that the emotion makes one difficult to be around doesn't settle whether it's ressentiment or some manifestation of anger that is not a form of ressentiment. Judging whether it's ressentiment is going to depend on the psychology of the agent, knowing more about that, and crucially, a normative judgment about it. And observers can be highly fallible and biased judges of this. A rush to label something ressentiment may be a way of unduly dismissing its legitimacy and avoiding a confrontation with a view, with a point, or with a person one doesn't want to deal with. So far, I've presented an account of what I take ressentiment to be. But what's to say that the state I've identified is appropriately described as ressentiment? The objection might run as follows. I've strayed too far from Nietzsche. The term really only makes sense in the context of Nietzsche's work and the examples he gives of it. In response, though, I would say Nietzsche has no proprietary claim on this notion. It was in discourse before him, now has some resonances of its own, which he played a key role, of course, in shaping, but not an exclusive role. Moreover, I don't want the account to turn on the word per se. I think what we have here is an important category or subcategory that we might want to think more about, an important psychological condition with which I take it most of us are familiar, and something that Nietzsche helps to put his finger on, but which we can theorize further. Now, as I've said, ressentiment and resentment are related as genus to species. So they're cases of resentment that are not cases of ressentiment. In the ethically admirable cases of resentment, you can look to the other agent second personally. It's a kind of moral equal, person to whom these grievances might be addressed, and try to resolve the situation that way. But that's not the dynamic that we see in ressentiment. Now, these issues of self-worth, entitlement, and status, they can suggest important similarities to envy as well. And of course, many cases of ressentiment also involve envy. In general, envy is about wanting something someone else has, the nice car, the good looks, the professional success, whatever it may be, and often suffering from the lack of it. But you needn't resent the situation if you're envious or regard it as unjust or demonize the possessor of the coveted good. And envy needn't involve a desire for revenge either. So I think not all cases of envy are cases of ressentiment, and not all cases of ressentiment are cases of envy either. So consider the reasonably well-off white nationalist, quote-unquote white nationalist. This person needn't be envious, but nonetheless thinks that there's some threat to the status to which he feels entitled. And that misguided sense of injustice is what's going to provoke ressentiment, but it's not going to provoke envy. Now, just to draw to a close here, some of the seeds of the view that I put forward are present in Nietzsche, but what I offer, as I say, is not meant to be an explication of his views. Some of the examples cited as cases of ressentiment may fall into disputed territory, and those wedded to a narrower view of it may bristle somewhat about the extension I've tried to make. What I've sought to suggest in the paper is that the cases in question form an interesting class, and ressentiment is the best term we have for describing such cases. But what's to say this is actually a psychologically important kind? Are we, in that frequent metaphor, carving nature at the joints in employing it? In order for it to be an interesting notion, for instance, do we have to identify some single, deeper causal mechanism that sustains it? Does it have to earn a predictive, or to earn its theoretical keep through some predictive or explanatory role? Well, there are a lot of larger methodological issues here which I can't settle. But one thing to note is the frequent co-occurrence or clustering of the features that I've described here. And I think that's a notable phenomenon to remark on. Likewise, we might notice patterns with other sorts of things, between ressentiment and other things, both in individuals and in larger social groups. And we might use that to support further inductive or abductive inferences. So we might explore particular hypotheses about other psychological phenomena with which it's correlated and speculate about why. Phenomena such as a sense of powerlessness, forms of narcissism, ego fragility, feelings of inadequacy, general irascibility, self-righteousness, delusion, paranoia, and other sorts of things. We might from a more sociological perspective, think about the sorts of formations and institutions that tend to precipitate it, perpetuate it, and to speculate on why. And those are tasks for further work, including empirical work in both psychology and sociology, which I hope would be complementary to what I set out here. And I would also stress in conclusion that even one who's not prepared to follow me to my view in condition 8 that this is a vice notion will at least, I hope, be able to get some illumination into other aspects of this phenomena thanks to conditions 1 through 7. Even with the extensive literature surrounding guilt, shame, jealousy, envy, and so on, their boundaries aren't as clear-cut as we might like. But with all of those states I just mentioned, we have far more philosophical resources for thinking about them and for thinking about their operations. And I think we need greater such resources when it comes to ressentiment. This will help us reflect on ourselves and on each other better as agents, not simply as rational agents, but as agents who are often irrational and sometimes gripped by feelings that are deeply nasty. As Nietzsche says at the beginning of the genealogy, we knowers are unknown to ourselves. It's difficult to admit that we collectively can be like this, but admitting this is a step forward to self-knowledge. Thanks.